It was a crisp Friday night, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the empty street. Inside the old Victorian house at the end of Elmwood Lane, four children, Mia, Jason, Emily, and Liam, sat cross-legged on the worn living room carpet. Their parents had left for the weekend, trusting Mia, the eldest at 14, to watch over her younger brother and their friends. Jason pulled out an ancient-looking Ouija board from his backpack, the corners chipped, and the letters faintly glowing. He had found it in his grandmother's attic and thought it would be fun to talk to ghosts while the adults were away. The others hesitated, but Jason's smug grin was contagious, and they agreed to play. The board felt heavier than it looked as they placed it on the floor. They lit a single candle and placed their fingers lightly on the planchette. "Is anyone here with us?" Mia asked hesitantly. At first, nothing happened. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then the planchette began to move, slowly, deliberately. It spelled, "Yes!" "Who are you?" Jason asked, his voice cracking slightly. The planchette slid to the letters one by one, spelling Hungry. The children exchanged nervous glances. Emily tried to laugh it off. "Hungry for what? Pizza?" Suddenly, the candle flickered violently, and the room plunged into darkness. The lights snapped off with a loud pop, leaving them in pitch black. A loud, piercing screech erupted from upstairs, followed by a heavy thud. It sounded like something enormous was moving in the bedroom above them. "Did you hear that?" Liam whispered, clutching Mia's arm. Before anyone could answer, the house began to tremble, the floorboards groaning as if alive. The Ouija board, now glowing faintly, started to shake. "We need to stop," Mia cried, trying to push the planchette to goodbye. But it wouldn't budge. The board seemed to fight back, the planchette jerking wildly. The walls around them began to shift and ripple, like waves in an ocean. The once cozy living room twisted into something unrecognizable. Long, distorted corridors replaced the familiar walls, and the furniture seemed to melt into the floor. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the upstairs hallway, slowly descending the creaking staircase. The children froze as the footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a wet, dragging noise. Liam, the youngest, screamed as the shadows coalesced into a grotesque figure at the base of the stairs. It was vaguely humanoid, but its features were distorted, as if it had been stretched and torn. Its hollow eyes locked onto them, and its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, dripping teeth. The children scattered, running in different directions. Emily bolted toward the kitchen, but the walls closed in on her, trapping her in a tightening corridor. The wallpaper peeled back to reveal a fleshy, pulsing surface, and before she could scream, the floor beneath her opened like a mouth and swallowed her whole. Jason sprinted toward the front door, but no matter how hard he ran, the hallway stretched endlessly. The house was alive, its hunger insatiable. A pair of skeletal hands erupted from the ceiling, grabbing him and dragging him upward into the darkness. Mia and Liam clung to each other, their backs against the living room wall. "We have to end the game," Mia shouted, pointing to the Ouija board, now glowing blood red. Liam, trembling, reached for the planchette, but the grotesque figure appeared before them, blocking their path. Its elongated arms reached out, pulling Liam from Mia's grasp. He screamed as the creature dragged him into the shadows. Desperate and alone, Mia lunged for the board. Her fingers trembled as she forced the planchette toward goodbye. The creature shrieked, its form flickering like a dying light bulb. Just as the planchette reached goodbye, the house let out a deafening roar, and everything went still. Mia opened her eyes to find herself sitting in the middle of the living room, the Ouija board lying innocently in front of her. The house was silent, and the lights were back on, but her friends and brother were gone. Tears streaming down her face, she called for them, but there was no answer. The house had claimed them, and she was left alone. The Ouija board sat untouched on the floor, but as Mia stared at it, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out one final message. "You're next." The shuffling night. Amara had always felt an inexplicable pull toward the French Quarter. It wasn't just the music, the food, or the vibrant culture. It was the city's pulse, the centuries-old magic that seemed to hum in the bricks beneath her feet. Coming to New Orleans for Christmas and New Year's was her way of reconnecting with her African roots, to explore the whispers of voodoo that had been passed down through her family. For 5 days, she had walked the streets, visited shops brimming with charms, talismans, and incense, and spoken to practitioners who greeted her with knowing smiles when she mentioned her heritage. Her grandmother had taught her the basics of protection spells and ancestral rituals, but tonight, something felt different. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, as if the city itself were alive and holding its breath. Amara adjusted her scarf and walked down the familiar street, the rhythmic sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence. She could see her shotgun apartment ahead. At least she thought she could. The wrought iron balconies and green shutters were unmistakable. But as she approached, an icy chill swept through the street, seeping into her bones. The gas lamps flickered, their flames bending unnaturally. The jazz music, which always seemed to float from the corners of the quarter, was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Then she heard it, a low, rhythmic hum. A chant carried on the wind. Amara stopped, her heart thudding in her chest. She looked around, her senses heightened. The streets were no longer the same. Buildings shifted, their facades rippling like water. What had once been a narrow alley was now an unfamiliar corridor, its walls covered in glowing, pulsating sigils. The city was moving, reshaping itself. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, and Amara whispered a prayer of protection as she clutched the small grease pouch hanging from her neck. "This can't be real," she muttered under her breath, but deep inside, she knew it was. She wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the shadows. Some were human, others not quite. Hooded figures draped in colorful garments, their faces hidden, carried staffs adorned with charms and bones. Their chanting grew louder, their movements flowing like an unnatural dance. Amara could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet, as though the very cobblestones were alive. She turned, hoping to find the familiar sight of her apartment, but it had vanished, replaced by a towering building with faintly glowing red windows. Her heart pounded faster. "This isn't happening," she whispered, but her feet carried her forward, quickening as the world around her grew stranger. The landmarks she had known so well were gone, replaced by warped versions of themselves. The air smelled of incense, but also of something metallic, something like blood. One of the hooded figures turned toward her. Amara felt its gaze, even though its face was hidden, sharp and cold like a dagger. The figure raised a hand, and the sigils on the walls flared brighter, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. "Why are you doing this?" Amara called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer, but the chant shifted. Suddenly, Amara felt an invisible tug pulling her forward. She stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her. The cobblestones beneath her shimmered, revealing glimpses of faces, hands, and eyes pressed against the surface as if trapped beneath the street. Desperate, she pulled out her grisgris pouch and scattered its contents, salt, herbs, a tiny bone, onto the ground. "By my blood and by my ancestors, I command you to stop," she shouted, her voice filled with raw defiance. The ground trembled beneath her feet, then stilled. The hooded figures hesitated, their chanting fading for a brief moment. But then a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the streets, shaking the buildings around her. "You think your small magic can challenge us?" A voice boomed, its source impossible to pinpoint. Amara stood, her heart racing, but her stance was resolute. "This is my city, too. You won't take it from me." The laughter grew louder, but the tugging sensation lessened. One by one, the hooded figures began to retreat, their movements fading into the shadows. The sigils dimmed, and the buildings slowly returned to their original forms, the streets no longer shifting under her feet. Exhausted, Amara stumbled toward what she hoped was still her apartment. When she reached the familiar green door, she collapsed against it, her body shaking with the intensity of the encounter. Inside, she lit a candle, whispering a prayer of thanks to her ancestors. The city had stopped shuffling, but the memory of that night would remain with her forever. She now understood that New Orleans held secrets far deeper than she could fathom, and though she had survived the shuffling night, she knew it wouldn't be the last.